Well, we're starting a new series this morning called The Gifts of Christmas as I try and open up my iPad deal because I don't waste paper and trees like a certain Mr. Ben Cathy. But that's okay. I'm not calling him out. So we're starting a new series this morning called The Gifts of Christmas, and we're going to last until Christmas itself and Christmas Eve. And we're going to be talking about all the different aspects of Christmas and whatnot it brings us. And this week, we're talking about the gift of expectancy. And we all feel like this dad in this video sometimes, don't we? Thanksgiving is over, and it's full steam ahead until Christmas. And some of you in this room might be Halloween is over, and it's full steam ahead until Christmas. And if that's you, we are praying for you at Hope Church, and we hope you find Jesus this morning. But the dad in this video gets Advent. The word itself means arrival. The season is all about getting ready for the arrival of Jesus. And today I want to talk about the background and what was happening in the time of Jesus' birth and the gospel writers and the Christmas story. And I think we never get to hear that story. So often we hear what's happening in Luke 2. So often we hear what the gospel writers had to say about, but we never understand what the world is like at the time of Jesus. So some of you may have already been thinking about it, but turn to your neighbor and think about where you would hide baby Jesus. Some really good ones last service. I heard like the roof. I heard like in my office, like I placed it outside the house. I'm like, I don't know if that's against the rules or not, but who knows. But so I think we have to keep Jesus not as such as much of an ornament. We don't look at Jesus as just, it's this time to celebrate Christmas and what all brings here. But we have to understand that this is the arrival of Jesus. This is when Jesus has come to bring about peace and to write a new story. So I think, like I said earlier, I want to talk about the background. I think a lot of people have a hard time reading the Bible because they don't understand its context, such as like if a society years from now or something was to look at a bunch of like social media posts, they'd be like, what's up with these two ladies and a cat yelling at each other? Thanks. I didn't get any last laughs. So right before the Christmas story and the Gospels in the Bible is the Old Testament. And there's 400 years in between the last book of the Old Testament and the first book of the New Testament. And this is often called the intertestamental period. Or you might hear people call it the 400 years of silence. And it's not so much that God was silent or gone as much as he was just reserved, as much as there was no ongoing revelation from him in the time. So in the world of the time of Jesus, they haven't had a divine interaction in 400 years, and all the world knew was Rome. The Roman Empire was the place to be. It was the place to live in. It was the person to talk to. It was the job you wanted. It was the largest empire at the time of the history of the world. It was a military machine that would destroy anyone or anything that came in its way. And it controlled, as you see on the map, it controlled from like Europe all the way to almost Asia. It was absolutely insane for the time. So it was huge, powerful, and destructive, the Roman Empire. And they believed in anything destructive. They killed everything that got in their way. And if you tried to start a revolt, or you lived within the empire and you didn't like what was happening, they would put you on a cross, put you on a hill. And so everybody passing through would see not to do whatever you did. They would see to stay away and to not challenge the authority of the Roman Empire. And a historian named Plebeian once said that it seems like everything they do is for terror. So Israel at the time was known as the province of Judea, and it's over there. You can see it over there. And a general named Pompey took it over. He waited until the Sabbath because he knew that the Hebrew people did not work on the Sabbath, that they were resting and they were worshiping. So he waited until then, and he came in there and he killed 12,000 people in order to take over the Israel nation and put it into the Roman Empire. So that's how it worked. That's how the Roman Empire worked, through violence, through destruction, and through authority. And so the leaders of said Roman Empire were a group of people and a family known as the Caesars. The first one was Julius Caesar, and he takes over the Senate. He takes over the Senate, and he becomes the dictator, if you will, of the Roman Empire. And he leads them to this conquest and this humongous empire that it becomes in that picture. And he gets killed eventually, and his son Octavian, who is later named Caesar Augustus, takes over. And in Greek, Caesar Augustus means the respected one. And in Luke chapter 2, he starts by saying, the world at the time was controlled by Caesar Augustus. So, I told you about Julius Caesar got killed and Augustus took over. When Julius Caesar got killed, there's this story in Greek mythology or Roman mythology that there was a star in the sky and it had a very long tail, and that was his soul ascending to be with the gods. So Julius was God, and he was divine to the people of Rome. And that was the story of him ascending to be at the right hand of all the rest of their gods. That, if you know anything about the Christmas story, should sound familiar. The story of a star with God. So for the star, they made a celebration, and they called it Advent. That should also be familiar. And for 12 days, they celebrated, they had feasts, they had parties, and it was just a whole time to celebrate Julius's life and what he had done for the Roman Empire and the people of Rome. That celebration of Advent should be familiar if you know anything about the Christmas story. So if Julius Caesar was God, that means that Caesar Augustus was the son of God, right? So that's what people called him back then. He was a high priest and a mediator, they would say. One Roman writer says in a work called the Aeneid, he says that he is here to bring about salvation and peace. He is a divine king, and one day he will bring about a new humanity. That should sound familiar as well. So the chant of all the Romans at the time was, that's just the thing slapping against the whatchamacallit. It's very loud. Very loud. But so the chant at the time was Caesar is Lord. And they would say it like a hello. Like they'd be like, hey Tim, how are you? Be like, hey buddy, what's going on? Caesar is Lord. And they'd be like, all right buddy, I'll see you later. All right man, Caesar is Lord. Like that's how it worked. It was just a greeting. That's what people said constantly. Caesar is Lord. Caesar is Lord. And they would have gatherings to continue this parade around the Caesars and around Caesar Augustus. And they would call it ecclesias. And that's how you say ecclesia. The word, what that means in Greek, ecclesia, is church. Church is ecclesia in Greek. So, there's a story that continues on. And at the time, Caesar Augustus, he called for a census because adultery was running rampant in the Roman Empire. He was like, how am I supposed to continue this great empire? How am I supposed to spread my name if there's no Roman babies, there's no Roman families, like what am I supposed to do? So he called for a census. And we can see that in Luke chapter 2, he tells us that at the time, there was a census declared by Caesar. And the last thing I want you guys to know is about the Roman Empire would be, as it would expand and move and as it would spread, they would have on their Roman coins, they would put the news of whatever it might be on the coin, because coin money spreads like wildfire throughout an empire. So what they would do is they put it on there, and then they would call this the gospel or the good news. The Roman people would call the news of their empire the gospel. Now, if you read into the Bible, if you read into history a bit further, you meet a character named King Herod. Now, King Herod is a guy who was extremely evil, and we see him as an evil person in modern light. And he killed a good amount of his family for suspected treason, for plotting against him. He killed millions of thousands of Jews for little to no reason at all. Now, but he wanted, if we put the map back up, he wanted Israel to be like this gateway into the Roman Empire. He wanted to be this economic powerhouse that people would see and be like, Rome's doing well, as people would come from Asia and whatnot. So he rebuilt a lot of things in Israel. He made a lot of things bigger and better. And for example, the Jewish temple, if you read in history books, it's known as the Herodian temple during this point. And it has these humongous stones, and they're so elegant and so huge, and nobody can understand, even to this day, how they got those stones in there, because they're humongous and heavy like nobody's business. So, to pay for all these projects, to pay for all these things, of course, he had to find money somewhere. Now, King Herod, to get money for these projects, he would tax the Hebrew people a ton. I mean, like between local taxes, between taxes to Caesar, between temple taxes, historians say that the Jewish people at the time were taxed about 90% of their income. 90% of their income. All right, so I know I just gave you guys a whole lot of information, so take a breath and high five the person next to you, because you can now pass a history of Western civilizations class. And I think we have a hard time understanding the Bible a lot of times. I think because we don't understand the context. And now we can look through the lens of the people at the time. The Hebrew people at the time, what were they experiencing? What were they expecting? They were a poor, marginalized, and oppressed people. They had only known Rome their entire lives, and they thought God had forgotten about them for the last 400 years. But in the middle of that terrible oppression, God decides to tell a new story with the gospel writers and with the birth of Jesus. And he uses the language and the culture of Rome, and he flips it around. He flips it on his head, because that's what the people of the time would understand. That's how they would understand his story that he's trying to tell. So there's a stark contrast between Rome and the biblical narrative. All the things I told you earlier, like ecclesias and churches, to the star story, to gospel, whatever it might be, the stark contrast is that they both use those things. The Roman Empire operates through violence and through destruction, but God's empire used it to operate through peace. God's empire isn't inclined to the powerful and the wealthy like Rome was. God's empire was inclined to the lost and to the lonely. And Jesus knew this. And in fact, in Luke 4, he's in his hometown, piece of A-Town down, and he unrolls this humongous scroll, and he reads straight from Isaiah 61. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has anointed me to bring gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, and that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come." And this was good news, because they were an oppressed, marginalized, and poor people in their society. God had forgotten about them. So maybe you're there today. Maybe you're sitting out in the crowd and you're saying, God has forgotten about me. Maybe you think you're an oppressed, marginalized, or poor person, and you think God has not heard my prayers. Or that you're in a season where you feel like God is silent and he's holding back for some reason. And we can look to our world and our culture of our modern day, and we can see Rome. We can see the oppression. We can see the sin. We can see the darkness. And it can be in false idols and consumerism and materialism. You fill in the blank. But God is flipping that script. Take hope in that God is flipping the script. There's a song called Seasons by Hillsong Worship, and it's great, and you should listen to it every single day that you're awake. It's the greatest song in the world. But the writer talks about how his inspiration, and he says that in Yosemite National Park out in California, there's these humongous sequoia trees. And he says that these trees live to be 3,000 years old, and that they're some of the biggest trees in the world. But they all start with a seed. And I think that's how God's promise, and that's how God's kingdom operates. We often think that one day we'll wake up with a humongous tree in our backyard. But it all just starts with a seed. And you look to your neighbor's backyard, you peek over the fence, you're like, God, what's up with this? All of his promises coming to a head. He's got a humongous sequoia tree. The fruits are falling off of it. What's up with that? How come mine is just a seed? How come I'm not having that? And you ask God, when is that going to happen for me? In reality, it already has, but it's just a seed. And something else that's interesting about these trees is that they need the harshness of winter in order to become everything they can be. They need the cold temperatures. They need the things that try to kill them in order to be everything they can be. And I think so many times we fall into that category. So many times we need that season. So many times God puts us through there in order to see his redemptive plan. In reality, it's just a seed, but he has already made a promise. So God has heard us. He hasn't forgotten about us. Rome does not have the final say, and Jesus does. Rome doesn't last, and the only kingdom that has lasted through our social kingdoms, through economic powers, in the history of the modern world, in the history of the entire world, the only kingdom that has lasted is the kingdom of God. And it will continue to last until the second advent, when Jesus returns and brings about a new humanity and all justice and peace is restored. Because nothing is impossible for God. Nothing is impossible for God. Even in the midst of the worst oppression and killing in human history, he gives a son to a virgin mother. So he always has a plan. And he's always unfolding redemptive history right before us. Always is. And this year, this Christmas, this Advent season, I hope you experience God breaking through that silence like he did after 400 years in Bethlehem. Let the light of Christ be the Savior and Messiah of the whole world come into this dark place and provide not only light, but also hope and joy and peace because of his advent, because of his arrival. So God gives a word of peace and expectancy to his people. He, when we need it the most, when we want him the most, he has plans for us. He gives us a word of peace and expectancy. And he always gives gifts to his kids. He always finds a way for us to come back to him. It's like, did you ever play that game when you were a kid, or someone played it with you, and you had like a candy or like a toy or something, and you put it in your hand, and you put them behind your back, and then you brought them out, and you're like, pick one. And then they pick it, and you do that until like they figure it out or not. But you never like play that game like 4 or 5 times, and then at the end you're like, life's full of disappointments, kid. You should just give up. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's never meant to be a mean game. And sometimes it might seem like God might be doing that with us. Sometimes it might seem like God has forgotten about us, like God is just playing with us. But his intention is to give us peace, is to give us salvation, is to give us perfect gifts. And we have that gift of expectation. We know who wins. We know that God is coming. And for 400 years, the Hebrew people expected a Messiah. They expected something to happen and to break through the oppression of the Roman Empire. But we see that story, and we see that Christ wins. Ultimately, Christ wins. And we can look at the empires of our modern day, the things that rule our society, things that have ruled our society, and the ever-heating political landscape and the ever-heating social landscape, and we see that God wins. And in time, it won't matter because God wins. Our sin, our darkness, our evil, God wins. We won't worry, we won't have to shame because we understand that God wins. So Advent should be about us preparing for God to do something new, to do a new thing in our lives, an unexpected thing, if you will. And God not only wants to do that new thing, but he wants to do it bigger and better than he's ever done before. That's so amazing that what God has done in the past was good, but it's nothing compared to what he's going to do next. The problem is that we often expect God to feed off our past expectations, to feed off what he's done in the past, and for him to do it again. And when we do that, we limit God. I think we put God in a box and we limit him and we say, you can only do this much because that's what you did for my buddy's sequoia tree over there. And God's not about the old, he's about the new. He's about the present, not about the former. And what God did in the past was great, but it's not enough for what he wants to do in your life today and this Advent season and the years coming up. And for God to do a new thing in your life, You can't live off the commitment you made in the past or even what God has done in the past. But the commitment and action you took in the past was good. It's just not enough for what he wants to do through you today and through you now. And that's why we need to prepare for what God is in your midst. In unexpected ways, as we close this morning, I want you to think about all the different ways that you want God to break through that silence. You want God to break through and give you peace of your expectancy. I think whether you write it down, whether you keep it in your mind, whether you take about it this week, write down, think about whatever it might be, your prayer of expectancy for God to do something great, for God to make this Advent season a season where Jesus is here, where Jesus is in your midst, where Jesus is breaking through that silence, where he is moving past everything that has happened through whether it might be grief, loss, hurt, pain, a broken relationship, a broken marriage, whatever it might be, that God is going to do something great. And his promise starts with a seed. Let's pray, Hope Church.